I am Joshua, 32 years old, and I sat completely silent at a luxury dinner table while my own mother looked at a room full of 30 people and called me a complete and utter failure. Before I tell you about the exact moment her jaw dropped and her entire fake social standing shattered into a million pieces right in front of her eyes, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Drop your city or state down below. The clinking of heavy silver forks against expensive fine china is a sound that usually means celebration. People are happy. People are drinking. People are coming together. But at the Millbrook Grill, the absolute most expensive, exclusive restaurant in our small Indiana town, that sound felt like a slow, agonizing countdown. I sat near the drafty front window at a small, cramped overflow table, a good 12 feet away from the center of attention. The center of attention, as it had always been for the last 29 years, was my younger brother, Carter, and his beautiful, wealthy fiancée, Sophia. The private dining room was suffocating. It smelled heavily of roasted garlic, expensive red wine, and a thick, heavy dose of tension that only I seemed to notice. My mother, Eleanor, was already 3 glasses of overpriced Chardonnay deep into her performance. She wore a heavy pearl necklace that she only ever brought out for Sunday church service and high-stakes social events where she needed to prove her worth to people who did not care about her. She held court at the main, long rectangular table. Her hand rested delicately over Carter's arm, projecting the flawless image of the perfect, loving, supportive American matriarch. My father, Robert, sat right next to her. He was quietly buttering a piece of dinner roll. He had perfectly mastered the pathetic art of being physically present in a room while totally checking out of reality. He never fought her. He never defended anyone. He just existed in her shadow. I was the ghost in that room. I wore a tailored, dark navy suit. My hair was neatly trimmed. My shoes were polished. But to the people sitting at that main table, I might as well have been wearing dirty rags pulled out of a dumpster. I was the dark secret they had to invite out of sheer obligation. Victoria, Sophia's mother, sat directly across the table from Eleanor. Victoria was a fiercely sharp woman. You could tell just by looking at her. She had silver hair cut in a very sleek, sharp bob, posture that demanded absolute respect, and cold, analytical eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She had spent the entire evening quietly observing our family dynamic. She watched the way Carter nervously deferred every single minor decision to Eleanor. She watched the way Robert stared blankly at his plate, terrified to speak out of turn. And eventually, inevitably, her eyes drifted over the floral centerpieces and landed on the overflow table. She looked right at me. She studied my face. She studied my isolation. "And the young man sitting by the window?" Victoria asked. Her voice was perfectly level, not too loud, but it possessed a specific frequency that easily cut through the soft jazz playing from the hidden ceiling speakers. "Is he also your son?" Eleanor's fake, practiced smile froze instantly. Her manicured grip on her wine glass tightened so intensely I saw her knuckles turn bone white under the dim restaurant lighting. She leaned in toward Victoria, dropping her voice down into that confidential, gossipy whisper. It was the exact tone she used when she wanted to destroy someone's reputation politely, wrapping her poison in a warm smile. "Oh, that's Joshua. He's adopted," Eleanor said. She paused deliberately, making absolutely sure the word adopted hung in the air like a medical disclaimer, like it explained away a terrible disease. "He cleans houses for a living." She said it the way you would describe a stain on an otherwise perfect rug. A massive, embarrassing blemish on her flawless family portrait. She did not say it with pity. She said it with pure, unadulterated shame. Robert did not even bother to look up from his bread plate. He just kept scraping the butter knife against the crust. "We have given up on him," my father added. His tone was perfectly calm, utterly devoid of emotion. He sounded like he was talking about an old lawnmower that just would not start anymore. The entire private dining room went dead silent. The woman sitting next to Carter's best man physically stopped chewing her food. Sophia's uncle looked down at his lap, his face flushing red with second-hand embarrassment. I did not move. I kept my hands folded neatly on the white tablecloth. I pressed my thumbnail into my index finger so hard it sent a shooting pain up my arm, anchoring me to the present moment. I refused to look away. I refused to look down. I looked straight into Victoria Holloway's eyes. Victoria did not look embarrassed for me. She did not look away in polite pity like the rest of the guests. She stared at me. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She tilted her head to the side, exactly the way a person does when a complex puzzle piece suddenly snaps firmly into place in their mind. "Wait," Victoria whispered, but in that silent, breathless room, the word carried perfectly across the tables. "You're the man who—" She stopped. She did not finish the sentence. Something massive shifted behind her eyes. It was recognition. Absolute, terrifying, undeniable recognition. Eleanor's face completely drained of color. Her mouth fell open slightly. My mother realized, in that one agonizing split second, that she had just proudly kicked open a door she could never, ever close again. The temperature in the room plummeted. The damage was done. But to truly understand how we got to this freezing public silence, you need to understand the 29 years of absolute coldness that built up to it. You need to know why I let them think I was nothing, and why I finally decided on this specific night that I had had enough. I was exactly 3 years old when Robert and Eleanor Meadows brought me home from the agency. For a few very short, very fleeting years, I was their little miracle. I was the incredibly generous, selfless deed they could proudly parade around the First Covenant Church every single Sunday. Pastor Collins used to pat my head at the end of the service and tell the entire congregation how wonderfully big-hearted the Meadows family was for taking in a boy with no background, no history, and no prospects. I was their living, breathing charity trophy. Then Carter was born. The shift in that house was not a slow fade. It was an immediate, brutal, and absolute replacement. It started with small, quiet things. My messy crayon drawings came off the kitchen refrigerator to make room for Carter's pristine ultrasound pictures. My little car seat was unbuckled and moved out to the dusty garage. By the time I turned 8 years old, my belongings were packed into cardboard boxes, and I was relocated from the warm bedroom right next to the master suite up into the converted attic. The attic was freezing in the harsh Indiana winters and completely suffocating in the humid summers. Eleanor told me with a sweet, fake smile that it was simply because Carter needed the space for his toys. But even as an 8-year-old child, I knew the raw truth. I was being systematically moved out of sight. I was being hidden. Carter immediately became the golden child. He could do absolutely no wrong in their eyes. If he ran through the hall and broke an expensive crystal vase, it was a harmless accident. He was just being an energetic boy. If I forgot to take out the kitchen trash on a Tuesday night, it was a massive, fundamental character flaw. It was proof of my bad genetics. Eleanor used to stand out by the mailbox on summer afternoons, talking to Mrs. Patterson next door, and I would hear her clear as day from the open front porch. "We try so hard with Joshua. We really do," Eleanor would sigh, shaking her head tragically. "But, some things just aren't in the blood. You cannot fight nature." She said it loudly enough for me to hear. She wanted me to hear it. She wanted me to deeply understand that my place in that house was strictly conditional. I was a guest who had vastly overstayed his welcome. Robert never corrected her. Not once. He would sit in his recliner, watching television, and let her verbally tear me apart. His silence was his endorsement. When it came time for high school graduation, the brutal reality of my situation became undeniable. Carter, who was still a freshman, already had a massive, fully funded college fund waiting for him. They talked about it openly at the dinner table. When I brought up my graduation, I was handed a cheap glossy pamphlet for a local community college and a firm, dismissive handshake from Robert. There was no party. There was no celebration. I knew with absolute certainty that I had to make my own way in this world. On the evening of my 18th birthday, I packed 2 worn-out duffel bags. The house was completely empty. Eleanor had taken Carter to an expensive out-of-state soccer tournament, and Robert was playing a weekend golf tournament. There was no birthday cake waiting on the counter. There was no card. There was not even a sticky note. I walked out of that large, beautiful suburban house with exactly $400 in a basic savings account. I had built that small amount by mowing neighborhood lawns and shoveling snow since I was 12. I took a bus to Greenfield, the next town over. I rented a tiny, cramped studio apartment located directly above a noisy, humid laundromat. The smell of cheap detergent seeped through the floorboards 24 hours a day. I needed a job immediately to pay the rent. I did not have a fancy college degree, I did not have any wealthy family connections, and I certainly did not have a safety net to fall back on. So I went to the local hardware store. I bought a heavy plastic bucket, a pack of abrasive sponges, a mop, and a gallon of heavy-duty industrial cleaner. I started cleaning houses. It was grueling, back-breaking, exhausting work. I scrubbed dirty baseboards until my fingers literally bled and my knees bruised. I scraped away black oven grease that had been baked on for years. I pulled clumps of strangers' hair out of clogged shower drains. I breathed in bleach fumes until my lungs burned. But every single dollar I made, I earned squarely on my hands and knees. It was not glamorous work. People looked right through me. But it was honest, and more importantly, it was mine. I was finally earning a real salary, however small it was at the very beginning. Nobody could hold it over my head. Nobody could tell me I owed them for it. My very first steady client was an elderly woman named Grace Whitfield. She was 74 years old, lived entirely alone in a modest ranch house, and suffered from severe arthritis that curled her hands. I spent 4 hours deeply cleaning her kitchen and her 2 bathrooms on a Tuesday afternoon. I scrubbed the grout with a toothbrush. When I finally finished and packed my supplies, she handed me a tall glass of sweet iced tea and a $20 tip. "Joshua," Grace said, looking at her gleaming, spotless countertops, "you clean better, and with more care, than any professional corporate company I have ever hired in my life. You should expand this. You have a real, rare talent for details. Do not sell yourself short." That one small, passing comment from a total stranger changed the entire trajectory of my life. While my brother Carter was aggressively partying at a prestigious state university, blowing through our parents' money and failing basic courses, I was sitting at a cheap folding table in my apartment, printing out hundreds of black and white marketing flyers. I posted them on every community board I could find. Within 3 months, I had too many clients to handle alone. I hired 1 assistant, then I hired 2 more. We saved up and bought a used, dented white commercial van. I officially registered the business with the state, Meadowshine Residential. I worked brutal 80-hour weeks. I barely slept. I studied aggressive business management, marketing, and accounting online late at night. I learned the hard way about supply chain logistics, employee quality control, and long-term customer retention. When Grace Whitfield passed away a few years later, I attended her funeral. I stood quietly in the back row of the church. I cried genuine tears, because that woman was the only person in my entire life who had ever looked at me and seen massive potential instead of a heavy, unwanted burden. Over the next 14 years, Meadowshine Residential did not just grow. It aggressively exploded across the market. I developed a highly standardized, rigorous training program for my cleaning staff. We transitioned from small residential homes to landing massive, highly lucrative corporate contracts with luxury rental properties and high-end real estate developers. By the time I turned 32, I had successful franchise locations operating aggressively in 14 different states. I had a ruthless executive team working under me, a sharp corporate lawyer on retainer to handle the massive expansion contracts, and a personal net worth that would literally make my adoptive parents' heads spin right off their shoulders. I was wealthy. I was secure. I was powerful in my industry. But I never, ever told them. Why? Because I learned very early on that they fed on my perceived failures. Every single time I tried to share a very small victory early in my career, Eleanor instantly found a strategic way to minimize it, crush it, or make it about Carter. When I proudly got my first official state business license, I framed it and texted her a clear photo. I waited hours for a response. She finally replied with one single word: cute. No period. No follow-up question. No congratulations. When I successfully opened my third regional office and hired my 20th employee, I called home, hoping for just an ounce of pride. Eleanor immediately cut me off mid-sentence to talk loudly about Carter's brand new promotion to an entry-level assistant manager position at a local branch bank. It was a job Robert had begged his friend to give him. I realized in that exact moment, holding the phone to my ear, that they absolutely did not want me to succeed. My total failure was a necessary pillar for their family narrative. If I was a broke, struggling failure, their horrible decision to neglect me and emotionally abuse me was completely justified. Look at him, they could say. We tried, but he was always destined for the bottom. But if I succeeded, if I built an empire, then they were simply the villains of the story. They were the fools who threw away gold. So I kept my mouth completely shut. I let them blindly believe I was still driving a rusting, beat-up van with a dirty mop bucket rattling in the back. I paid my taxes, I expanded my territory, and I built my multi-million-dollar empire in total, absolute silence. I let them keep their smug superiority, knowing the truth was sitting right in my bank account. The heavy, expensive cream-colored envelope arrived securely in my mailbox on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The return address was embossed in real gold foil lettering. I opened it slowly. Carter Meadows and Sophia Holloway. Engagement dinner. Millbrook Grill. Saturday evening at 6 o'clock. I stood in my massive home office, staring at the thick cardstock for a very long time. I had not seen my family in person for nearly 2 solid years. I regularly called them on major holidays. I dutifully sent polite, expensive gift baskets that they likely threw away, but I kept my physical distance to protect my own peace. I was seriously debating throwing the fancy invitation straight into my heavy-duty paper shredder when my cell phone suddenly rang. The caller ID flashed brightly on my desk. It was Eleanor. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for the emotional toll, and answered. "Hello, Joshua," she said. No polite hello. No asking how I was doing. No warmth whatsoever. "You got the invitation in the mail." "I did," I replied, leaning back in my leather ergonomic office chair. I looked out the massive floor-to-ceiling window of my corporate headquarters, watching the city traffic move far below me. "Listen to me carefully," Eleanor said, her voice instantly dropping into that tight, highly controlling register I knew so intimately from my childhood. "The Holloways are very, very important people in this state. Sophia's mother, Victoria, runs some sort of massive, highly connected real estate investment firm. This is big money, Joshua. Generational wealth. We are talking about people who sit on charity boards." "Okay," I said, keeping my tone completely neutral. I did not give her an inch of emotion to feed on. "I just need you to blend in on Saturday," Eleanor continued, her tone sharp and commanding. "Do not draw any attention to yourself. Do not make a scene. Wear a nice suit if you even have one that fits properly. And Joshua, please, for the love of God, do not bring up your work." My jaw tightened instinctively. The muscle in my cheek jumped. "My work. The cleaning thing," she said, letting out a very sharp, highly uncomfortable laugh that grated on my nerves. "It is just not the kind of impression we need to make right now. Carter is marrying into a very respectable, highly educated family. We absolutely cannot afford any embarrassments. If anyone at the dinner asks you what you do, just tell them you are currently between opportunities. Or say you do odd jobs. Understand?" I closed my eyes. I gripped the armrest of my chair. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her request burned deep in my chest. She was literally asking me to erase my entire existence, to lie about my life, just to protect a fragile, fake reality she had desperately built around Carter. "I won't embarrass you, Mom," I said quietly. The word Mom felt like ash in my mouth. Before she could issue another command, I hung up the phone. I almost did not go. It would have been infinitely easier to stay home in my quiet house, review my quarterly financial reports, eat a good steak, and completely ignore the toxic, destructive gravitational pull of my adoptive family. It was safer to stay away. But later that exact same night, Carter sent me a text message. It was the first time he had texted me in 6 months. "Hey man, I know things are really weird with Mom right now, but I really want you there this weekend. Please come. It wouldn't be the same without you." It was an incredibly weak, pathetic attempt at brotherhood, but for some stupid reason it worked. I read the text and I suddenly remembered the tiny little boy who used to sneak up the creaky stairs to my freezing attic bedroom when he was terrified of loud thunderstorms. That was long before Eleanor thoroughly taught him that associating with me was a social disease. I decided to go. I was not doing it for Eleanor. I was not doing it for Robert. I was doing it for that terrified little boy in the attic. Saturday evening finally arrived. I drove my car to the restaurant. I did not take my daily driver. I took the very subtle, dark sedan, specifically avoiding drawing any attention. I pulled into the back of the Millbrook Grill parking lot, avoiding the valet so Eleanor wouldn't see me pull up. I straightened my tie, checked my watch, and walked through the heavy glass front doors at exactly 6 o'clock sharp. The private back room they had rented was undeniably beautiful. There were tall, fresh floral arrangements on every single table, expensive low ambient lighting, and soft, live jazz music playing. There was a massive, long rectangular table situated right in the very center of the room, fully set for roughly 20 of the most important guests. Tucked away in the far back corner, directly next to a drafty window and the swinging kitchen doors, was a much smaller, round table set for 4 people. I walked over to the main table, my hands resting lightly in my pockets, to find my embossed name card. I slowly scanned the elegant, looping cursive letters printed on the heavy cardstock. Sophia, Carter, Eleanor, Robert, Victoria, David, Pam. I walked around the entire massive table twice, checking every single seat. My name was not there. There was exactly one empty chair left. It was located right next to Carter. I stepped toward it, logically assuming that maybe my name card had simply fallen off the table or been misplaced by the staff. As I reached my hand out to touch the back of the wooden chair, Eleanor materialized beside me as if she had transported through the floor. "Oh, Joshua, you actually made it," she said. Her voice was loudly cheerful for the room, but her eyes were completely dead. She did not reach out to hug me. She did not even fully face my body. Without missing a beat, she took her large, obnoxiously branded designer handbag and slammed it squarely down onto the seat of the empty chair right next to Carter. I stopped. I looked at the heavy leather bag. Then I slowly looked up at her face. "Is someone sitting here?" Eleanor did not blink. Her smile remained plastered on her face, completely unmoving. "The main table is totally full, sweetie. The event coordinator messed up the numbers. There is a nice spot reserved for you right over there." She pointed a sharply manicured index finger directly toward the small round table hidden in the dark back corner. I slowly turned my head and looked over. Sitting heavily at the overflow table was a second cousin named Gary, who was already aggressively ordering his 3rd beer and loudly complaining to the waiter, and a great aunt who was half-deaf and staring blankly at the wall. It was the absolute bottom tier. It was the kids' table, the exile table, the place you put people you actively hope will leave early. I looked back at Carter. He was sitting less than 2 feet away. He saw exactly what his mother was doing. He looked directly at the expensive purse sitting on the chair meant for his only brother. He briefly looked up at my face, and then he quickly, cowardly looked down at his polished leather shoes. He was not going to say a single word to defend me. He never did. He was terrified of losing his inheritance, his status, his comfortable little life funded by Eleanor and Robert. A freezing cold wave of absolute clarity washed over my entire body. I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice or make a dramatic scene to embarrass them. I simply nodded once, turned on my heel, and walked straight to the overflow table. I pulled out my chair and sat down. From this specific vantage point in the corner, I could see the entire layout of the room. I could see the wealthy Holloways cheerfully mingling with my lying parents. I felt completely, utterly invisible. And as I sat there, listening to Cousin Gary launch into a loud, bitter tirade about his messy divorce and the brutal custody battle over his hunting dogs. I realized that this isolation was exactly Eleanor's grand design. She did not just want me to politely blend in. She wanted me completely hidden from the world. The formal dinner service officially began. The highly trained waitstaff moved seamlessly and silently around the crowded room, pouring expensive vintage wine and setting down hot plates of thick prime rib and beautifully seared scallops. I ate my food very quietly in the corner, nodding politely and making non-committal grunts to Cousin Gary, who was now aggressively explaining how his terrible lawyer completely botched his alimony settlement. At the prestigious main table, Eleanor was firmly in her absolute element. She was putting on the greatest performance of her entire lifetime. She projected her sweet, melodic voice just loud enough so that the entire room of 30 people was forced to hear her every word. "We are just so incredibly, deeply blessed," Eleanor announced, raising her crystal wine glass slightly to catch the ambient light. "Carter has always been such an intensely driven young man, ever since he was a little boy, always at the very top of his class, always taking the initiative in everything he touches. When he finally got that big promotion to assistant manager at the bank last month, Robert and I just wept. We physically wept with pride. He is building such an incredible future." Pam, Eleanor's best friend and chief lifelong enabler, loudly clapped her hands together from 2 seats away. "He is an absolute star, Eleanor. You raised a perfect gentleman." Victoria Holloway, the bride's mother, sat very quietly at the head of the table, methodically cutting her prime rib. She was undeniably polite, nodding at the exact right, socially acceptable moments, but her eyes were deeply analytical. She was not buying the performance blindly. She was heavily studying Eleanor. Then, David, Sophia's uncle, leaned forward heavily on his elbows. He was a large, jovial man with a thick gray beard and a booming, friendly voice that naturally carried over the music. He looked directly past Eleanor's perfectly styled hair and spotted me sitting alone by the dark kitchen doors. "Hey, Carter," David called out loudly across the table. "Is that your older brother sitting way over there? Joshua, right? Come on over here. Son, pull up a chair. How are things going with you? What line of work are you in these days?" It was a completely genuine, friendly question. David was simply trying to include the quiet guy sitting alone in the corner. He had no idea he had just lit a fuse. Before I could even physically open my mouth to respond to him, Eleanor panicked completely. Her survival instincts kicked into overdrive. She slammed her heavy wine glass down onto the table, way too hard. Deep red wine aggressively sloshed over the crystal rim, violently staining the pure white tablecloth like a fresh wound. "Oh, David, let's please not bore everyone tonight with tedious business talk," Eleanor laughed. It was a sharp, brittle, desperate sound that made the hairs on my arms stand up. She pressed a manicured hand flat against her chest. "Joshua is, well, he is still finding his way in the world. We aggressively tried everything with him. Expensive piano lessons, elite sports camps, private tutors. Nothing ever stuck. You know how it is with some kids." David frowned deeply, looking genuinely confused and slightly offended. "I just politely asked the young man what he does for a living." Eleanor sighed dramatically, a heavy, theatrical sound. She looked directly at Victoria, desperately trying to build some sort of twisted upper-class camaraderie. "He scrubs toilets, David. He cleans dirty houses. It is just him, a rusty van, and some plastic buckets. We absolutely did our very best to guide him, but as Robert always says, we have sadly given up on him." The air in the room instantly evaporated. That was the exact moment the suffocating silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. That was the specific moment my own mother consciously decided that protecting her fragile ego was completely worth publicly executing my human dignity. I sat back hard in my wooden chair, my jaw clenched so aggressively that my back teeth physically ached. A thick blue vein throbbed on my temple. I looked directly at Carter. He was staring intensely at his half-eaten scallops, absolutely refusing to look up and intervene. I looked over at Robert. My father was meticulously wiping the spilled red wine with his white cloth napkin, pretending nothing had happened. Then I looked at Victoria Holloway. Victoria had completely stopped eating. She placed her heavy silver fork and knife down on the very edge of her porcelain plate, aligning them perfectly parallel. She looked at Eleanor with an expression of cold, calculated, mild disgust. And then, she slowly, deliberately turned her head and locked her sharp eyes directly with mine. That was the exact second the complex gears in her sharp business mind started turning. She studied my face. She studied my calm posture. She studied the precise, expensive tailored cut of my dark navy suit. She looked down and noticed the incredibly expensive, understated luxury watch sitting on my left wrist. A vintage piece that easily cost more than Carter's entire annual salary at the bank. "Wait," Victoria whispered. The heavy tension in the room was thick enough to physically choke on. Every single person was frozen in place. Victoria leaned forward smoothly, resting her elbows firmly on the table. She completely ignored Eleanor's existence. She kept her sharp eyes fixed firmly, unwaveringly on me. "Joshua," Victoria said, her clear voice echoing loudly in the dead quiet room. "What is the exact name of your cleaning company?" Eleanor desperately tried to intercept the conversation again, her voice rising in panic. "Victoria, really, it's just some small local outfit. He doesn't even have a—" Victoria held up one single, commanding hand. She didn't even turn her head to look at Eleanor. "I asked Joshua." I reached up and calmly set my cloth napkin down on the overflow table. I looked straight into Victoria Holloway's piercing eyes, and I spoke slowly and clearly, ensuring that every single person sitting in that room heard my exact words. "Meadowshine Residential," I said. The heavy name hung suspended in the dead air. Meadowshine Residential. Victoria's eyes widened by a microscopic fraction of an inch. It was the absolute only crack in her fiercely composed, professional exterior. She slowly, deliberately pushed her heavy chair back and stood up to her full height. "Excuse me for just one brief moment," she said to the table. She reached down, picked up her expensive clutch purse from the table, and walked out of the private dining room. Through the clear glass partitions separating the room from the hallway, I watched her walk away. She stopped, pulled a sleek smartphone out of her bag. She typed something in furiously with her thumbs. She stood there, perfectly still, staring intensely at the glowing screen for a very long, agonizing 10 seconds. Then, she looked up from her phone. She looked right through the thick glass, straight at me. A slow, terrifying, deeply satisfied smile spread across her face. She turned around and walked back into the dining room. Every single eye in the room was glued to her. She walked gracefully back to her seat at the head of the table, but she absolutely did not sit down. She placed her hands flat on the white tablecloth, leaning forward slightly, taking absolute, terrifying command of the entire room. "Eleanor," Victoria began, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm, low register. "I have sat here and listened politely to you talk about your perfect family for the last 2 hours. I have listened to you aggressively brag, and I have listened to you cruelly belittle. But I cannot, and will not, sit here and listen to you lie to my face." Eleanor's fake smile violently trembled. Her hands shook. "Victoria, I truly don't understand what you mean. I am not lying about anything. Joshua really does clean houses. Joshua," Victoria interrupted, her voice slicing cleanly through the tense air like a sharpened butcher knife, "is the founder and current acting CEO of Meadowshine Residential. He aggressively operates a massive commercial and residential cleaning franchise that currently spans across 14 different states. He employs roughly 87 full-time corporate staff members. And according to the extensive Forbes business feature I just pulled up on my phone, his company's verified annual revenue is rapidly approaching $2.8 million. Someone sitting at the far back of the room let out a loud, audible gasp. Pam, the loyal best friend, literally dropped her heavy silver fork onto her china plate with a loud, ringing clatter. Cousin Gary choked violently on his beer, coughing into his napkin. Eleanor physically recoiled. Her body jerked backwards, sinking deep into her chair, as if Victoria had just reached across the table and slapped her hard across the face. What? No, that is completely impossible. It's a van. He just has a little van. It's a bucket. It is a massive corporate fleet, Eleanor. Victoria corrected her sharply, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. She turned her head slowly to look at the entire table, making absolutely sure that every single guest was paying full attention to her next words. And I should know exactly how incredibly successful his national business is. Because 2 years ago, my real estate investment firm was desperately looking for a highly reliable, scalable contractor to service all of our luxury properties across the entire Midwest. I read a detailed article about a brilliant, ruthless young entrepreneur who built an absolute empire from absolutely nothing. I personally requested a meeting with him. I sat in his boardroom. I heavily vetted his corporate financials. Victoria paused. She let the heavy weight of her words crush the room. She looked right at Eleanor, preparing to deliver the final, fatal, undeniable blow. I am one of his primary strategic investors. The silence that followed that statement was absolute. It was suffocating. It was the deafening sound of an entire fake, carefully constructed reality violently shattering into millions of tiny, irreparable pieces. 30 people were staring directly at me. The quiet guy sitting at the pathetic overflow table. The guy who was just publicly called a massive disappointment. The guy they had all spent the last hour actively pitying. Robert's mouth was literally hanging open. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, as if I was a dangerous stranger who had just aggressively broken into his home. Carter looked like he was going to physically vomit. All the blood had completely drained from his face. Joshua, Eleanor stammered. Her voice was violently shaking. Her perfect, upright posture completely collapsed in on itself. She looked incredibly small, deeply panicked, and entirely desperate. Is this true? Why didn't you ever tell us? Why didn't you say anything to me? I slowly pushed my wooden chair back. It scraped loudly against the floorboards. I stood up. I didn't rush. I took my time. I calmly buttoned the center button of my tailored suit jacket. I looked down at the woman who had intentionally spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, worthless, and utterly dependent. You never asked, I said. 3 short words. They hit her infinitely harder than any screaming insult I could have possibly thrown. This is the moment that changed everything, when I finally took back control of my life. Thank you for staying with me this far. You are amazing. Please help me like this video and comment the number 1 below, so I know you are here with me. This not only helps more people find this story, but it tells me that my experiences matter to someone. Your support is my biggest motivation to share the rest of this journey. Eleanor's face horribly contorted. The initial blinding shock was rapidly being replaced by a desperate, frantic, pathetic need to somehow save face in front of her peers. She looked wildly around the room. She realized in real time that the entire room was silently judging her. She realized that Victoria Holloway, a powerful woman she desperately, pathetically wanted to impress and align herself with, was looking at her with absolute, unmasked disgust. Well, Eleanor violently choked out, frantically forcing a ghastly, tight, highly unnatural smile onto her face. She reached her shaking hand across the table, desperately trying to physically grab Victoria's arm to establish a connection. I always knew he had massive potential. Didn't I just say that, Robert? I always said Joshua had an incredibly strong entrepreneurial spirit inside of him. We always fully supported him. It was just tough love. That's exactly what it was. We aggressively pushed him so he would learn to be completely independent. Victoria slowly, deliberately pulled her arm far away from Eleanor's desperate reach. She looked at my adoptive mother with a level of pure contempt that could easily freeze boiling water on contact. 2 minutes ago, Victoria said, her voice dripping with pure, jagged ice. You proudly told this entire table that your son scrubbed dirty toilets and that you had completely, utterly given up on him. Do not insult my basic intelligence, Eleanor. And do not ever try to take credit for a man who brilliantly built himself up in spite of your abuse. Pam, Eleanor's lifelong best friend and closest confidant, slowly, wordlessly slid her heavy wooden chair a few inches away from Eleanor. The loud scraping sound echoed in the quiet room. Even her closest, most loyal ally was aggressively abandoning the sinking ship to save her own social standing. I looked over at Carter. He was sitting completely frozen, staring at Sophia. Sophia was looking right back at Carter with total, unadulterated horror in her eyes. She was finally seeing the pathetic cowardice in the man she was about to legally marry. She was seeing the dark truth of a family that could happily torture their own son and then lie about it to a room full of people with a bright smile. I didn't come here tonight to prove anything to any of you, I said. My voice was calm, but it echoed clearly in the massive room. I came because Carter specifically asked me to. I came because I genuinely wanted to be here for his important night. I looked directly into Eleanor's panicked eyes. She violently flinched under my gaze. But I will not sit at any table in any room where my mere existence is treated as an embarrassing stain, I said, making sure every syllable landed perfectly. And I will absolutely not pretend that we are a real family just because you desperately need an audience for your fake life. I didn't wait for her to stammer out a pathetic response. I didn't need one. Her silence was everything I needed. I slowly turned my body to face Victoria. Thank you, Victoria, I said quietly, giving her a respectful nod. I will see you at the big board meeting next Tuesday morning. Victoria nodded firmly back at me, a look of profound, undeniable respect settling on her sharp face. I turned my back on the main table. I walked slowly and purposefully past the 30 completely stunned, silent guests. I walked out the heavy front doors of the Millbrook Grill. The cool Indiana night air hit my face, sharp and clean. I walked straight to my car, got in, and aggressively gripped the leather steering wheel. My hands were violently shaking, not from fear, but from the massive, overwhelming adrenaline dump of 29 years of heavily repressed anger finally leaving my body. I started the engine and drove away into the night, leaving them sitting entirely alone in the massive wreckage of their own lies. And I knew with absolute certainty that long before the sun came up the next morning, the social fallout in that small, gossipy town was going to be absolutely biblical. Small towns operate on a very specific, highly volatile currency. That currency is gossip. And in a town like Ridgewood, Indiana, news does not just travel fast. It arrives before the breakfast dishes are even cleared the next morning. I woke up the Sunday morning after the catastrophic engagement dinner in my own bed, in my own quiet, peaceful house. I made a pot of black coffee. I sat on my back porch and watched the sunrise. My phone was completely silent. I had preemptively blocked Eleanor and Robert's phone numbers the minute I walked out of that restaurant. I did not need to hear their frantic, desperate attempts to rewrite the history of what had just happened. But I did not need to be in that town to know exactly how the fallout was actively destroying Eleanor's carefully constructed universe. You have to understand how my mother operated. She had spent the last 15 years aggressively building her ironclad reputation as the undisputed backbone of the women's ministry at the First Covenant Church. She organized the annual canned food drives. She aggressively coordinated the massive Easter egg hunts. She was always the very first person to eagerly sign up for every single prestigious planning committee, and she was always the absolute last person to leave every highly visible community potluck. She fed on the admiration of other people. It was her oxygen. That Sunday morning, less than 12 hours after the disaster at the Millbrook Grill, Eleanor confidently walked into the church lobby wearing her best floral dress. She expected things to be normal. She expected her loyal subjects to greet her. They did not. The story of the dinner had already spread through every single private Bible study group text message, every local hair salon appointment, and every produce aisle in a 20-mile radius. The specific, juicy details varied wildly depending on who was telling the story. Someone falsely claimed I owned a massive corporation with 10,000 employees. Someone else swore up and down that Victoria Holloway had aggressively written me $1 million check right there on the stained restaurant tablecloth. But the core, undeniable truth of the story remained exactly the same. Eleanor Meadows had intentionally, cruelly humiliated her own son in public, and it had backfired on her in the most spectacular, embarrassing way imaginable. When Eleanor approached her usual prayer circle in the church foyer, two prominent families quietly turned their backs and walked away. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was no yelling. There was just a sudden, highly coordinated, absolute freezing out. Pam Driscoll, Eleanor's lifelong best friend and loyal sidekick, refused to make eye contact with her during the entire sermon. On Monday morning, Pam actually called Eleanor, but she did not call to check on her feelings. She called to officially deliver a harsh verdict. I heard about this entire exchange weeks later from a mutual acquaintance. Eleanor, I think you seriously need to call Joshua and apologize properly, Pam had said, her voice completely devoid of its usual warmth. People are talking. Everyone is talking. Talking about what? Eleanor had snapped defensively, immediately going into her usual victim mode. I am his mother. I have the absolute right to correct my children. You have the right to be a mother, Pam replied coldly. You do not have the right to publicly humiliate that boy in front of 30 influential people just to make yourself look important. I cannot be associated with this kind of cruelty, Eleanor. Do not call me again until you fix this. Pam hung up the phone. Eleanor lost her biggest ally in a matter of seconds. Meanwhile, the massive collateral damage hit Carter the hardest. The grand, expensive wedding was not officially canceled, but it was aggressively postponed. Sophia Holloway was a highly intelligent, fiercely independent woman. She had sat at that table and watched the man she was supposed to marry completely fold under his mother's toxic pressure. She watched him stay dead silent while his own brother was being verbally crucified. Sophia drove to Carter's apartment the following weekend. She sat him down at his kitchen table and completely dismantled his reality. She told him that she loved him, but she absolutely refused to marry into a family that operated like a hostile cartel. She had already called her wealthy family lawyer to immediately halt the drafting of their complex prenuptial agreements. She told Carter that if they went through with this wedding right now, she would be setting herself up for a miserable, toxic marriage and an inevitable, ugly divorce. She demanded they pause everything. She required him to attend intense individual therapy, and she demanded couples counseling before she would even consider setting a new date. Carter did not fight her on it. He cried, but he did not argue. For someone raised by Eleanor Meadows, accepting blame without shifting it was an act of extraordinary, unprecedented courage. He agreed to every single condition. The following Thursday, I received a short, polite email from Victoria Holloway. She asked if I was available to meet her for a quick coffee. She chose a very quiet, high-end bakery in Marion, a city safely away from the loud, gossipy noise of Ridgewood. I arrived 10 minutes early. I ordered a black coffee. Victoria walked in a few minutes later, looking as impeccably sharp and intimidating as she did at the dinner. She sat down across from me at the small wooden table. She wrapped both of her hands around her ceramic mug and looked directly into my eyes. Joshua, Victoria said, getting straight to the point, I owe you a massive, sincere apology. I shook my head slightly. You don't owe me anything, Victoria. You simply told the truth in a room full of people who prefer lies. I told your personal truth publicly, without explicitly asking for your permission first. She corrected me firmly. I am a businesswoman. I deal in facts and leverage. In that heated moment, I simply reacted to your mother's appalling behavior. I used your incredible success as a heavy weapon to shut her down. I made a massive decision on your behalf, and I should have pulled you aside first to give you the choice. For that lack of boundary respect, I am truly sorry. I let her words sit in the quiet air for a moment. It was profoundly shocking to hear a parental figure apologize to me with such raw, unvarnished honesty. If you had asked me beforehand, I finally said, I honestly probably would have told you to not even bother. I have spent my entire adult life purposefully not correcting people about my life. I learned early on that it was safer to let them underestimate me. And how has that specific strategy worked out for you? Victoria asked, raising one perfectly arched eyebrow. I almost smiled. Not great. It gets heavy. Victoria took a slow sip of her coffee. When I initially invested heavily in Meadowshine Residential 2 years ago, it was strictly because you were incredibly smart, your business model was completely bulletproof, and your profit numbers were incredibly solid. That professional respect has not changed. But after witnessing that dinner, I respect you for something else entirely. What is that? I asked. The way you handled yourself when the bomb went off, she said. There was absolutely no shouting. There were no pathetic tears. There was no screaming retaliation. You just stood up, established a firm boundary, and walked out of that room with your dignity completely intact. That kind of profound emotional control is significantly rarer than people think in the corporate world. We sat there for another hour. We did not talk about Eleanor anymore. We talked about business. We talked about aggressive expansion plans for the upcoming fiscal quarter. We discussed aggressively increasing the starting salary for all of our regional area managers to improve long-term retention. It was the most deeply understood and respected I had felt by an older adult since the day of Grace Whitfield's quiet funeral. A full month passed. The dust in Ridgewood slowly began to settle, but the landscape was permanently altered. One evening, I was sitting in my living room, reviewing a massive new commercial cleaning contract, when the doorbell suddenly rang. I wasn't expecting any company. I walked to the front door, checked the security camera monitor, and froze. It was Carter. He was standing on my front porch, shifting nervously from foot to foot. He looked terrible. He had clearly lost weight. There were dark, heavy bags under his eyes, and he was wearing a wrinkled hoodie instead of his usual perfectly pressed bank attire. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. We just stood there, staring at each other across the threshold for a long time. "Hey," Carter said. His voice was incredibly raw and raspy. "Carter," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. I didn't invite him in immediately. I needed to know why he was here. "Can I come in?" he asked, looking down at his shoes. "Just for a few minutes. I promise I won't stay long." I stepped back and opened the door wider. He walked into my house. He looked around the large, beautifully furnished living room with wide, completely totally amazed eyes. He was seeing the physical proof of the empire I had built alone. He walked over to the mantel and looked at a framed photograph of Grace Whitfield, the only picture I had on display. He finally turned to face me. He looked completely broken. "I am so sorry, Joshua," Carter said, and then his voice completely broke. He covered his face with his hands and started sobbing. Deep, ugly, agonizing sobs that shook his entire body. I didn't move to comfort him. I let him cry. He needed to feel the absolute weight of what he had allowed to happen. When he finally calmed down enough to speak, he wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie and looked at me with red, bloodshot eyes. "I am not apologizing for Mom," Carter said, his voice shaking. "I cannot fix her. I am apologizing for me. I am apologizing for knowing exactly how terribly they treated you your entire life, and just sitting there. I sat there every single brutal holiday, every single tense dinner, every single time Mom said something horribly cruel to you. I just stared at my plate. I was such a pathetic coward. I looked at my brother. I saw the massive damage the golden child syndrome had done to him. He was a prisoner in his own life. "Why did you stay quiet, Carter?" I asked him directly. I needed to hear him say it out loud. He swallowed hard. "Because I was terrified," he admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I was terrified that if I ever spoke up and defended you, she would turn that absolute freezing coldness onto me. I saw how she completely erased you. I knew my entire massive college fund, my shiny new car, my easy little job at the bank, my future inheritance. Everything was completely tied to her approval. It wasn't free money, Joshua. It was a heavy leash. It was blood money. He looked around the room again. And then I look at you. You walked away with absolutely nothing. No safety net. No college fund. You built this massive company from nothing. And it terrified her. I frowned. What do you mean it terrified her? Carter looked me dead in the eyes. This was the twist I had never fully understood until this exact moment. Mom didn't hate you because you were a failure, Joshua, Carter said quietly. She hated you because you were strong. She realized very early on that you did not actually need her to survive. You were completely independent. And for a raging narcissist like Eleanor, having a child who doesn't need her money or her approval is the ultimate threat. She needed someone weak to aggressively control. She needed me. If you succeeded without her help, it meant her money and her power meant absolutely nothing. She had to destroy your reputation to protect her own fragile ego. It hit me like a physical punch to the chest. The 29 years of abuse, the attic bedroom, the snide comments by the mailbox, the humiliation at the restaurant. It was never about my lack of worth. It was entirely about her lack of control. I looked at Carter. He was finally waking up from the nightmare. Sophia called off the wedding, didn't she? I asked softly. Carter nodded, wiping his eyes again. Postponed. Indefinitely. She told me I need to figure out how to be a real man before I can be a husband. She was absolutely right. I started therapy last week. It is brutal, man. Realizing your entire life is built on enabling a bully. It takes a lot of strength to admit that, I said, and I genuinely meant it. We talked for 3 solid hours. We talked about our childhood. We talked about the ghosts in that massive, cold house. Before he left, I walked him to the front door. I am not going to call Mom or Dad. I told him honestly. I am permanently done with them. But if you want to get a beer sometime, just you and me. My door is open. Carter nodded. A small, genuine smile finally breaking through the tears. I would really like that, Joshua. Thank you. The next morning, I drove to my corporate headquarters. The massive glass building gleamed in the early morning sun. I walked into the main office floor. The phones were ringing, people were aggressively typing on keyboards, the energy was electric. Carla, one of my very first full-time employees, walked up to my desk holding a bright pink pastry box. She had been with Meadowshine since the days we only had one rusty van. Morning, boss. Carla smiled widely. I brought donuts. We are celebrating. What are we celebrating today, Carla? I asked, taking a fresh donut from the box. She pulled a folded piece of paper out of her pocket and proudly slammed it onto my desk. It was a signed mortgage approval document. I just officially closed on my very first house, Carla said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. 3 bedrooms. A huge backyard for my kids. I used the massive bonus from my promotion last quarter for the entire down payment. I never, ever thought I would own a home, Joshua. Thank you for taking a massive chance on me. I looked at the approval document. I looked at Carla's beaming face. I thought about Eleanor calling my business a joke. I thought about the 30 people at that table who thought I was a failure. And then I looked at the incredible, thriving, beautiful community of hardworking people I had aggressively built with my own 2 hands. I had created a company that paid fair wages, offered real benefits, and changed the trajectory of people's lives. You earned every single penny of that house, Carla? I said, feeling a massive lump form in my throat. I am incredibly proud of you. I walked into my private corner office, closed the heavy glass door, and sat down at my desk. I was finally truly free. I am sitting in my corporate office right now as I tell you this story. It is late in the evening. The massive building is completely quiet. The city lights are glowing softly outside my floor-to-ceiling windows. I just finished reviewing the final, legally binding contracts for our brand new expansion into 3 more states down south. The numbers are incredible. The growth is absolutely exponential. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the wall opposite my desk. It is completely bare, except for one single small wooden frame. Inside that frame is a crisp, perfectly preserved $20 bill. It is the exact tip Grace Whitfield handed me all those years ago when my hands were bleeding from scrubbing her kitchen grout. It is a constant, physical reminder of exactly where I started, and the incredible power of one single person believing in your potential when your own blood relatives absolutely refuse to. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between meetings, my mind drifts back to that freezing attic bedroom in Indiana. I remember the paralyzing, suffocating loneliness of being a child in a massive house full of people who actively wish you were invisible. I remember the raw, agonizing sting of Eleanor's cruel words at the dinner table. But it doesn't hurt anymore. The venom is completely gone. Because I finally realized the greatest, most profound truth of my entire life. True success is not the $2.8 million in verified annual revenue. True success is not the expensive tailored suits, or the luxury watch, or the respect of powerful business investors like Victoria Holloway. True success is the absolute, unshakable ability to independently define your own self-worth without ever needing the permission, validation, or approval of the people who desperately want to see you fail. Eleanor Meadows spent 29 years aggressively trying to convince me, and the entire world, that I was a broken, defective, worthless human being. She needed me to be a failure to justify her own terrible choices. She needed a scapegoat, and for a very long time, I quietly accepted that incredibly heavy burden because I falsely believed that family meant enduring abuse with a polite smile. I was completely wrong. A boundary is not a brick wall designed to keep love out. A boundary is a heavy, locked door designed to keep toxic poison from seeping into your life. And you, and only you, hold the key to that door. You get to permanently decide who is allowed to sit at your table. I haven't spoken a single word to Eleanor or Robert since the night I walked out of the Millbrook Grill. I didn't send a holiday card. I didn't call on birthdays. I completely and utterly removed their access to my peace. And in return, my business skyrocketed. My anxiety vanished, and my life became profoundly, beautifully quiet. Carter and I are slowly, carefully working on rebuilding a relationship. It is not easy. There is a lot of heavy baggage. But he is actively doing the hard work in therapy. He is finally learning how to stand on his own 2 feet without the suffocating safety net of our parents' toxic money. Sophia is cautiously supporting him from a distance. I don't know if they will ever actually get married, but I do know that Carter is finally awake. He is no longer the golden child trapped in a gilded cage. He is just a man trying to be better, and I deeply respect that. I am sharing this deeply personal story with you today not to brag about my financial success or to publicly shame my adoptive family. I am telling you this because I know with absolute certainty that someone watching this video right now is sitting in the exact same painful position I was in. Someone out there is dreading the upcoming holiday season. You are aggressively dreading sitting at the end of a long dining table, listening to a narcissistic parent or a toxic sibling completely minimize your achievements, mock your career, and treat your mere existence as a massive disappointment. You are sitting there quietly, twisting your napkin under the table, wondering if maybe they are right, wondering if you really are the problem. You are not the problem. I want you to hear this loud and clear. You do not need anyone's permission to aggressively succeed. You do not need anyone's formal acknowledgement to make your massive achievements real. And you absolutely, under no circumstances, need to passively accept being humiliated, degraded, or belittled just to keep your assigned seat at a toxic family table. Walk away from the table. Build your own table. This brings me to the most important part of this entire journey, and the core educational lesson I want to leave you with today. If you grow up in an environment where your worth is constantly attacked, your brain is trained to accept disrespect as love. You are conditioned to believe that you must continually earn your right to exist. But here is the hard, beautiful truth. Family is not just about blood, and it is certainly not about shared DNA. Family is about consistent, mutual respect. It is about the people who actively protect your peace, not the ones who constantly test your sanity. The greatest lesson I learned from building an empire from a mop bucket is that your lowest moments do not define your final destination. When people try to tear you down, it is almost always a direct reflection of their own deep-seated insecurities and failures, not yours. Eleanor's cruelty was a projection of her own massive fear of losing control. When you finally recognize that their abuse is about them and not you, you instantly take your power back. Do not waste your precious energy trying to aggressively prove your haters wrong. Spend that energy quietly, consistently building a life so incredibly beautiful and successful that their loud opinions simply no longer matter. I want to hear from you now. What is the one major lesson or takeaway that resonated with you the absolute most from my story? Have you ever had to firmly cut off a toxic family member to aggressively protect your own mental health? Please drop your thoughts, your experiences, and your stories down in the comments below. We are building a strong community of survivors here, and your voice matters incredibly. Or, if this story simply gave you the courage or the validation you desperately needed today, just leave the word "good" in the comments so I know you are walking away with value. Your engagement helps push this message out to the people who desperately need to hear it the most. Thank you for your time, thank you for listening, and remember, never let anyone else hold the pen when you are writing the story of your life. I will see you in the next video.